U.S.A. election news. Media gets nothing from Kamala Harris. That's mostly our fault. Who knows what CNN viewers thought of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz's big interview last week? Given the watchers and clicks, I think all sides at the table considered it a minor victory. That interview was a good example of why journalist-candidate talks rarely yield anything substantial. The failure is mostly ours. If journalists want to shed light on their candidates and elevate the process, they must reconsider their questions. That's no criticism of CNN, an important news source, or anchor. Since we covered our first presidential campaign 24 years ago, Dana Bash has been a serious reporter. This is more about our industry's faulty approach to presidential and presidential candidate conversations. A journalist may interview Harris in several ways. CNN was doing the institutional interview, the most common. It's more about promoting the network or newspaper that secured it than about any journalist's or audience's objective. As soon as a news outlet secures an exclusive interview like this one, they are always described as such. A team of reporters, editors, and researchers creates a list of highly scripted questions to elicit an uncanned response that will make headlines and envy the rest of the media. This has happened for decades. When I had my first presidential interview as a young reporter at Newsweek in the late 1990s, it was a major magazine. Ask your parents. I was surprised to learn that I would not be able to have a discussion. I read from a pre-approved list of questions in the Oval Office, like the subway announcer who warns you to avoid the closing doors. News organizations perceive these interviews like Hollywood views a formulaic sitcom. The first episode is about this, the second about that, and so on until the season is over. The show's core focus is to trick the candidate into admitting inconsistencies, hence the questions cover a variety of themes. Increasingly, interviews like this are planned with social media in mind, where hordes of politically fueled opponents on either side are ready to cry about the unasked question or the unspoken falsehood. Networks and news sites feel pressure to appear strong and punitive to deter tweets from random people who will never be satisfied. In this CNN interview, Bash asked Harris why she changed her mind regarding fracking before moving on to decriminalizing illegal immigration. Harris avoided these questions, which were pointless because voters with even a basic understanding of politics knew the answers. Candidates change their positions to the moment because they want to win. That's politics. However, if you write political profiles, as I did for magazines for years, or if you're a long-form television raconteur like Larry King or Charlie Rose, you attempt to be more analytical. These interviews are more like feature films, where a series of questions narrates a tale from start to finish. Instead of forming a committee of reporters and editors to go over a candidate's past utterances, you start by asking the most fundamental journalistic question. What do we want to know about this person? What's really intriguing me? Because if you do a lot of extended interviews with cautious politicians, most will tell you things if you seriously want to understand their perspective. If all you do is answer loaded questions, you get bland deflections. I think I would have ignored policy questions if I had interviewed Harris. Walz should have been a different interview. Harris has no policy platform, thus she will ramble when challenged. I would have explored two subjects instead. I would have began with something CNN barely touched on briefly, which has been Harris's experience for weeks. What may her honest recounting of her unusual adventure say about who she is and how she manages the unexpected? I would have next turned to her major weakness as a politician, her well-deserved reputation for speaking about policy in incoherent cliches. Instead of trying to put her in a rhetorical box, I would have questioned her directly, which probably no one has, why she sometimes seems reluctant to talk without a script. When she gets stuck in text, what does she think? Does she realize why some distrust her policy knowledge? Does she consider it unfair? I'm curious if Harris thinks about these things. I think many voters would. You also learn as an interviewer that smart presidential candidates have agendas. I constantly pay attention to the term a candidate incorporates into every answer or pivot. It shows where the candidate thinks they have a winning argument or a problem to fix. John McCain pre-butted our hour-long foreign policy interview in 2008 for the first 15 minutes, like a filibuster. I discovered what was making him furious without asking. Harris and the network failed on this, which would bother a Democratic operative. Her only goal was to stay calm, which she did. Her great surprise was answering a query by appointing a Republican to her cabinet. Get the defibrillator. Did Harris want you to hear her argument? Any point she burned to persuade? Apparently not. Her aides let her come to the table with no plan other than to avoid the traps, suggesting either a shocking lack of political knowledge or a lack of substance to say. Journalism and candidates may be struggling because we're so out of practice. Believe it or not, presidential candidates used to have to do lengthy interviews. I interviewed John F. Kerry for a 2004 New York Times Magazine article for 4 unpleasant hours. I'm convinced that won't happen again, and it's not because Kerry regretted our interviews after Republicans turned a harmless terrorism phrase into a TV campaign.